White officer spits on black man, then learns he's the new police chief. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share where you're watching from in the comments section. Your support will help us bring more meaningful stories like this. It was a sweltering Tuesday morning in late August when Richard Nelson, the newly appointed police chief of Blue Ridge, North Carolina, stepped out of his car and into the heart of the precinct he would soon command. He had spent 2 decades in law enforcement, rising through the ranks with a reputation for being fair but unyielding in his pursuit of justice. Yet today he did not look the part of a man who held power. He wore a faded plaid shirt, jeans that had seen better days, and sneakers with scuffed soles, a deliberate choice. He wanted no one to recognize him, no one to suspect the true purpose of his visit. Blue Ridge was a picturesque town nestled in the rolling hills, known for its quiet streets and tightly knit community. But beneath that charming facade, the police department had long been plagued by whispers of misconduct. Excessive force complaints, racial profiling, and deep-seated favoritism had created an atmosphere of distrust among the very people the officers were sworn to protect. Richard had heard the rumors before accepting the position, but he needed to see for himself. He wasn't interested in staged welcomes or forced smiles. He wanted the truth, unvarnished and raw. The parking lot buzzed with activity. Officers leaned against their squad cars, sipping coffee and exchanging stories. Some laughed, others shared low murmurs. Richard walked past them unnoticed, his presence blending into the ordinary hum of the morning shift change. He adjusted the brim of his baseball cap and took a steadying breath. He had no illusions about the challenges ahead. As a black man stepping into a leadership role in a department with a history of internal strife, he knew his presence alone would ruffle feathers, but that didn't concern him. He had a mission: to uncover the culture of this precinct, to see how his officers behaved when they thought no one was watching. He entered through the side door, where the scent of burnt coffee and aging furniture greeted him. The overhead fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the worn-out desks and cluttered paperwork. Phones rang sporadically, and the low murmur of voices filled the space. Officers sat in groups, reviewing reports, scrolling through their phones, or engaging in idle banter. No one gave him a second glance. Then a voice cut through the chatter. "You..." Richard turned his head slightly, catching sight of a white officer approaching with an unmistakable swagger. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a gleam. The nameplate on his chest read, "Daniels." A few other officers nearby paused their conversations, their eyes flicking between the 2 men with keen interest. Daniels stopped a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You lost or something? This ain't a shelter. You need to take that mess somewhere else." The words hit like a slap. Richard studied the officer's face, searching for any sign of recognition. There was none. Daniels saw only what he wanted to see: a man who didn't belong. Richard could have ended it right there. He could have pulled out his credentials, watched the color drain from Daniels' face, and delivered swift consequences. But he held his tongue, letting the scene play out just a little longer. Daniels took a step closer, his tone sharpening. "You deaf? I said get out. We don't need people like you hanging around." A chuckle came from behind him, followed by a murmur of agreement. One officer leaned against a desk, watching with amusement. Another muttered something under his breath, drawing laughter from a few others. Richard's stomach twisted. He had suspected there were problems within this department, but witnessing it firsthand was something else entirely: the blatant disrespect, the lack of hesitation. It was clear this wasn't the first time Daniels had treated someone this way. And then it happened. Daniels sneered and spit. The warm saliva struck Richard's cheek, sliding down his skin in a slow, humiliating trail. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The precinct, filled with noise just seconds before, became eerily silent. A few officers snickered, one slapping the desk in approval. Another shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. No one stepped forward to stop it. No one called out the blatant disrespect. The room waited, watching for Richard's reaction. His jaw tightened, but he did not lash out. He had spent years learning how to temper his anger and how to remain composed even when faced with the worst kind of provocation. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief. He wiped his face, the motion measured and deliberate. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but laced with steel. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" he asked, his eyes locking onto Daniel's. Daniel scoffed, oblivious to the storm he had just walked into. "Yeah, and what of it? People like you need to know their place." The silence stretched, thick with tension. Then Richard straightened, his hand dipping into his back pocket. He pulled out his leather badge holder and flipped it open, the gold shield gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The room collectively inhaled. Daniel's face drained of color. His smirk vanished, replaced by something closer to horror. The officers who had been laughing a moment ago now shifted uncomfortably, some backing away, others suddenly finding their desks incredibly interesting. Richard held his gaze steady. "I suggest you reconsider your words, Officer Daniels, because as of today, I am your new police chief. And we are going to have a very long conversation about exactly what kind of place this is." Daniels smirked, his arms crossed over his chest. "Only the ones who don't belong here." His remark was met with another round of laughter from the gathered officers, the camaraderie in their shared amusement palpable. The sound echoed down the hallway, but Richard remained silent. His expression remained unreadable, his jaw tightening slightly as he turned away from the group without a word. The laughter continued behind him, but it no longer mattered. He had seen what he needed to see. Without hesitation, he walked down the hallway, his polished shoes striking the tile floor with purpose as he headed toward the precinct's main office. A sudden burst of static erupted from the overhead intercom, followed by the familiar voice of the station's dispatcher. "All personnel report to the briefing room immediately. Repeat, all personnel to the briefing room." Richard exhaled slowly, glancing once over his shoulder before continuing toward the designated meeting space. It was time. Inside the briefing room, the atmosphere was lively, the hum of conversation filling the air as officers filed in. Some carried steaming mugs of coffee, others leaned in close to exchange hushed jokes, their laughter bubbling beneath the surface. The energy was relaxed and casual, business as usual. Richard entered through a side door, now holding a thick folder emblazoned with the precinct's official seal. He remained just outside the main line of sight, observing as familiar faces filled the room. Some of them were still chuckling from the earlier exchange in the hallway, their amusement lingering. At the front of the room, Captain Harris stood with an air of authority, his stocky frame filling the space behind the podium. His graying mustache twitched slightly as he cleared his throat and raised a hand, commanding silence. "All right, settle down, everyone," he said, his deep voice carrying over the chatter. "We've got an important introduction today." The noise died down almost instantly. Officers turned their attention forward, their curiosity piqued. Near the back, Daniels leaned against the wall, his smirk still firmly in place, his arms crossed once again, as though expecting another chance to be entertained. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment one below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Captain Harris adjusted his glasses and glanced at the assembled group. As most of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. We've been anticipating his replacement, and I'm pleased to finally introduce the man who will be leading this department. A man with an extensive record, a sharp mind, and a vision that I think will serve us all well. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Officers exchanged glances, some nodding in approval, others waiting with guarded skepticism. Then, with measured steps, Richard moved forward. The room stilled as he walked to the podium, his presence commanding attention without a single word. The weight of his gaze alone sent a hush over the assembled officers. He set the folder down carefully on the lectern, his fingers tapping the edge once before he straightened and scanned the room with a slow, deliberate sweep. Daniel's smirk faltered. Recognition dawned in his eyes, and for the first time his confident posture wavered. The color drained from his face as he shifted, his arms unfolding. The officers around him noticed, their expressions shifting from mild interest to something more uncertain. Some whispered in hushed tones, others merely stared, their brows furrowed. Richard let the moment before he spoke, his voice even and composed. "Good morning," he began, his tone carrying an authority that left no room for doubt. "My name is Richard Nelson. As of today, I am your new chief of police." The silence that followed was almost deafening. Daniel's face turned a deep shade of red. His confidence, so palpable moments ago, had all but evaporated. His eyes darted around, searching for something, anything to anchor himself to. Richard's gaze lingered on him for just a fraction longer than necessary before shifting to the rest of the room. The officers watched him intently, waiting. "When I arrived this morning," Richard continued, his voice steady and unwavering, "I chose to come in plain clothes. Not out of convenience, but because I wanted to see this department through an unfiltered lens. I wanted to witness its culture without introductions, without titles. What I saw was enlightening." A ripple of murmurs stirred in the crowd, but Richard simply lifted a hand, a small, precise movement that was enough to quiet them. "In just a short time, I have observed behaviors that are not only unprofessional but unacceptable for a department that is meant to uphold justice and integrity." His voice hardened slightly, his words cutting through the still air like a blade. "Let me be clear. Whatever culture has been allowed to fester here ends today." Heavy silence settled over the room. Some officers stiffened in their seats. Others averted their gaze. Daniel shifted again, swallowing hard, his discomfort clear. Richard took a slow step closer to the edge of the podium, lowering his voice just enough to make them lean in. "Respect is not a suggestion. It is the foundation of everything we do as law enforcement officers. Without it, we fail. Not just each other, but the people we have sworn to protect." He let that sit. He wanted them to feel it, the weight of responsibility, the expectation. Then, after a beat, he continued, his voice sharp yet composed. "This morning I watched as some of you laughed at what you thought was just another powerless man being put in his place. A harmless joke at someone else's expense. But let me remind you, everyone who walks through these doors deserves respect, whether they wear a badge or not. That is not up for debate." The tension in the room was almost suffocating now. No one moved. No one dared. Richard scanned their faces, taking his time, letting the silence do the work for him. He knew what they were thinking. He could see it in their eyes. Some were uneasy, some were ashamed. Others were simply processing what this meant for them going forward. Daniels, however, was visibly struggling, his bravado slipping away with each passing second. A thin sheen of sweat formed on his brow, his previous confidence now a distant memory. Richard wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. "I understand that change is difficult," Chief Richard said, his voice steady yet charged with authority. His gaze swept across the room, taking in the assembled officers, each standing at rigid attention. "They understand that habits, cultures, and long-held attitudes do not shift overnight. But let me be unequivocally clear. There will be zero tolerance for conduct that disrespects the dignity of any individual. Whether they are a fellow officer, a civilian, or someone society has deemed disposable, that kind of behavior ends today." He let the word settle, watching as a few officers exchanged uneasy glances. Then, with measured steps, he descended from the podium, closing the space between himself and his officers. His presence was formidable, his posture unwavering, his voice carrying a controlled intensity that left no room for misinterpretation. "Officer Daniels," Richard called out, stopping just a few feet from the man. The mention of his name sent an almost imperceptible jolt through Daniels' body. The bravado he had exuded earlier had all but vanished. His jaw clenched, and his fingers twitched at his sides, but his eyes refused to meet the chief's. "You," Richard continued, his voice firm, his gaze unrelenting, "are a living example of what is broken in this department. When you spat in my face, it was not just an act of disrespect toward me as a man. It was an insult to the badge you wear, to the oath you swore, and to the very community you claim to serve." Daniels swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Chief, I didn't realize." "And that," Richard interjected sharply, "is precisely the problem. You didn't think. You didn't care to consider the weight of your actions or the consequences of your attitude, because deep down you assumed the man standing in front of you didn't matter. That assumption, the ingrained belief that some lives hold less value than others, is why this department has lost the trust of the people it exists to protect." A murmur ran through the crowd, barely audible, but Richard caught it. He turned his attention back to the assembled officers, ensuring his words were meant for all of them, not just the man standing before him. What I witnessed today wasn't just the failing of one officer. It was a symptom of a larger disease, a culture within these walls that tolerates and at times even celebrates prejudice, bullying, and abuse of power. That culture has taken root here, festering unchecked for far too long. And I'm here to tell you," his voice rose, sharp and unwavering, "that stops now." Silence blanketed the room. No one moved. No one spoke. Officers who had once been comfortable in their complacency now shifted uneasily in their boots, their gazes flitting to the floor, to the walls, anywhere but at the man calling them to account. Richard stepped back toward the podium, planting himself firmly behind it. "I have spent my career fighting for justice, not just in the streets, but within the very institutions that claim to uphold it. Change is never easy. It will be met with resistance. It will make some of you uncomfortable, but let me be clear. As long as I am chief, this precinct will operate with integrity, with respect, and with accountability." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, ensuring the weight of his words pressed against every single person standing before him. Then, with a subtle nod toward Captain Harris, he delivered the next blow. "Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended pending an internal investigation." A collective intake of breath filled the room. Daniels' face turned a deep shade of crimson, his hands curling into fists at his sides as he stood frozen in place. His fellow officers cast furtive glances at him, some in shock, others in recognition of an overdue reckoning. Richard pressed on. "And for those of you who think this is just a slap on the wrist, think again. This is not about punishment for one man's actions. This is the beginning of a systemic overhaul. This is the first of many changes, and you will either rise to meet the standard, or you will find yourself outside these walls." A ripple of uncertainty passed through the crowd. Richard saw it in their eyes. The battle between defiance and reluctant understanding, between fear and the dawning awareness that the old ways were crumbling. His tone softened, but only slightly. "This is not about stripping you of your authority. It is about reminding you of the responsibility that comes with it. The power you wield is not a weapon, it is a duty. If you are unwilling to honor that duty, then this is not the place for you." Another pause, another long, measured look around the room. "If you are ready to do better, to be better, then we move forward together. But mark my words, I will hold you accountable every step of the way." The meeting ended in a silence that was far heavier than before. The officers dispersed slowly, their usual casual chatter absent, replaced by the weight of what had just transpired. Richard remained at the podium, watching as Daniels stormed out, his face twisted in barely contained fury. Others followed in silence, their expressions ranging from shame to reluctant contemplation. Back in his office, Richard exhaled deeply as he settled into his chair. He knew today was only the first battle in a much larger war. The attitudes entrenched in this precinct had taken years, decades to form. They would not be dismantled in a single meeting, a single action, or even a single tenure. Some would fight against change with everything they had. Others might never change at all. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. But Richard hadn't come to Blue Ridge to be liked. He had come to make a difference. The phone on his desk rang, cutting through the heavy quiet. He picked it up without hesitation. "Harris," he said simply. A pause. Then the captain's voice, measured and steady. That was quite the statement. Richard allowed himself a small, tired smile. It had to be made. And Daniels? Richard leaned back, eyes narrowing. That's just the beginning. Chief, I just want to say, you handled that situation far better than most of us could have, Harris began cautiously, his tone laced with both relief and admiration as he stepped into the quiet office. Richard, ever composed, even in the aftermath of tension, offered a brief nod and replied, "Thanks, Captain." He paused, his eyes scanning the room as if weighing the gravity of the next task. "But remember, the real work is just beginning. I need a comprehensive review of Daniel's file on my desk by tomorrow morning. I'm talking about every complaint, every incident report, everything you can find. We're not leaving any stone unturned." Without missing a beat, Harris responded, "It's done." Yet, as he spoke the words, he hesitated slightly before adding with a touch of amusement, "And Chief, I believe you rattled a few cages out there today, in the best possible way." After the call ended, Richard allowed himself a brief, private moment of satisfaction, a fleeting smile that acknowledged the small victory, before he turned his full attention to the towering stack of paperwork that awaited him on his desk. The mountain of documents was a tangible reminder of the long road ahead. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere at the precinct underwent a noticeable transformation. Where once officers might have snickered at Daniel's notorious antics, there was now an air of caution and distance surrounding him. The news of his suspension circulated like wildfire, and whispers of disapproval and relief mingled in the corridors. Determined to set a tone of accountability and support, Richard made it a point to walk the halls every day. As he strolled through the precinct, he greeted each officer with a nod or a few kind words. His steady presence became a symbol of leadership and change, a reminder that every member of the department was expected to uphold a higher standard. Some officers embraced this new direction wholeheartedly. One afternoon, Officer Reyes, a bright young recruit whose earnest eyes betrayed a mix of hope and regret, approached him in the quiet hallway. With her voice trembling slightly under the weight of her confession, she admitted, "Chief, I've been part of that toxic culture too. I stayed silent out of fear of what might happen if I spoke up." Richard stopped, meeting her gaze with a look of understanding and encouragement. "I appreciate your honesty, Reyes," he said, his voice both kind and resolute. "That's all I ask from you, to recognize the mistakes and commit to doing better. It truly starts with each one of us." Not everyone, however, was ready to accept this new order. Daniels, refusing to accept the consequences of his actions, filed an appeal against his suspension, arguing that he had been treated unfairly. Yet Richard was unmoved by the challenge. He stood firm, underpinned by his unwavering belief that accountability was non-negotiable. A thorough review by the department soon revealed a long list of grievances against Daniels. Reports of excessive force, numerous complaints about inappropriate comments, and a pattern of behavior that could no longer be overlooked. When the appeal was ultimately denied, Richard made it unequivocally clear the days of sweeping misconduct under the rug were over. Even as the internal changes began to take shape, Richard was acutely aware that transforming an entire department was a marathon, not a sprint. Conversations around implicit bias and community relations stirred mixed feelings among the officers. Some were eager to learn and improve, while others clung to outdated practices. But for Richard, every small step, a recruit daring to speak out, an officer re-evaluating their long-held assumptions, was a significant victory on the path to lasting change. One crisp morning, while attending a local community event designed to foster dialogue between the police and residents, Richard encountered a moment that resonated deeply with him. Amid the lively crowd, a young boy with wide, curious eyes mustered the courage to approach him. "Are you the chief?" the boy asked, his voice filled with a blend of awe and uncertainty. Richard knelt to be at eye level with the child, offering a warm smile as he replied, "Yes, I am." The boy hesitated before speaking again, his tone barely above a whisper. "My dad says the police don't care about us." There was a fragility in his words that spoke volumes of past disappointments. Gently, Richard placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "I can't change what happened before," he explained softly. "But I promise you, we're working hard to do better. If you ever need help or just want to talk, don't hesitate to come find me, all right?" The boy's hesitant nod eventually blossomed into a small, hopeful smile, a quiet affirmation that perhaps things were starting to change. By the close of his first year on the job, the precinct was far from perfect, yet it had undeniably shifted. Officers resistant to change had gradually left, making way for recruits who shared Richard's vision of fairness, respect, and accountability. Even the community, once marked by skepticism and disillusionment, began to witness the signs of transformation, a deliberate effort to build trust and bridge long-standing divides. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard stood in the main hallway of the precinct. He watched quietly as officers filed out after their shifts. The sounds that filled the corridor, gentle laughter and genuine conversations, felt different now. They were not the hollow echoes of camaraderie at another's expense, but the sincere interactions of a team united by purpose. Standing there, Richard acknowledged that challenges would always lie ahead. Yet, for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel hopeful. Change was undeniably difficult, fraught with setbacks and resistance, but every struggle was a necessary part of building something better, and in that moment, as he watched his team and community take tentative steps toward a more just future, he knew with certainty that every fight was worth it. And that brings us to the end of this powerful story. Richard Nelson's journey as police chief wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about transforming a culture and proving that leadership means standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Now, we want to hear from you. What lesson did you take away from this story? What's one thing you've learned that you will apply in your own life? Let us know in the comments below. If you like this video, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories like this to light.